There comes a moment quiet, unsettling, and oddly clear when reality stops feeling quite real. I do not mean that the world disappears or that you lose your senses. I mean something subtler. The familiar weight of things loosens. The solidity you once trusted begins to feel thin, almost transparent. And you find yourself wondering, perhaps for the first time, what it is that you have been calling reality all along. Let me ask you something directly, and I invite you to answer honestly in the comments below. Have you ever looked at your own life, your routines, your ambitions, even your thoughts, and felt as though you were watching them from a slight distance, as if they belonged to a dream you were just beginning to wake up from? Here is a simple fact that most people overlook. What you call reality is not the world itself, but your interpretation of it. You do not experience raw existence. You experience a mental rendering, a continuous translation made of language, memory, expectation, and habit. When that translation falters, reality feels strange. This is not madness. It is perception becoming honest. From childhood, I was taught, as you were, to treat the symbols of life as more real than life itself. Words, numbers, roles, and rules became the map, and the map was mistaken for the territory. When that mistake runs smoothly, no one notices. When it begins to break down, the world feels unreal. Consider this carefully. A tree is not the word tree. A moment is not the thought about the moment. And yet most people live almost entirely among words and thoughts, rarely touching the living thing itself. When attention slips out of the mental commentary and into direct experience, the world can feel unfamiliar, even unreal, not because it has vanished, but because you are finally seeing it without the usual filter. This shift often arrives during stress, loss, deep questioning, or sudden insight. The mind, overwhelmed or interrupted, loosens its grip. And when the grip loosens, the sense of "this is how things are" weakens with it. Here is an argument worth sitting with. The feeling that reality has stopped being real is not a failure of perception. It is a failure of assumptions. The assumptions that once held everything together, who you are, what matters, where you are going, begin to wobble. And wobbling assumptions make the world feel unstable. Most people rush to fix this feeling. They distract themselves. They seek reassurance. They cling harder to routines and identities. But doing so only pushes the question deeper underground, where it returns later with more force. Notice how frightening uncertainty is to the mind. The mind wants definitions. It wants certainty. It wants to say, this is real, that is not. But reality itself does not come labeled. Labels are applied after the fact. When you see this, certainty collapses, and the collapse feels like unreality. Another fact you can verify in your own experience is this. The sense of me is also part of the interpretation. The self you think you are, your story, your image, your personality is a process, not a thing. When you glimpse that process in motion, the solid me becomes questionable. And when the me becomes questionable, the world built around it feels equally uncertain. This is why moments of derealization often coincide with moments of self-questioning. If the observer is unstable, the observed cannot remain fixed. Yet there is nothing wrong happening here. In fact, something profoundly right may be taking place. The spell of familiarity is breaking, and familiarity, though comforting, is not the same as truth. Reality does not owe you comfort. It owes you only itself. When reality stops feeling real, you are being invited to look more closely, not to analyze endlessly, but to notice directly, to feel the texture of experience without immediately naming it, to listen without translating everything into thought. This is difficult because the mind has been trained to narrate constantly. Silence feels suspicious, presence feels empty, but that emptiness is not a void. It is space, the space in which experience actually occurs. If you resist this space, you suffer. If you allow it, something else emerges, a quieter, more immediate sense of being alive. When reality begins to feel unreal, fear often follows quickly behind it. The mind reacts as though something essential is being taken away. It says, "I am losing my grip," or "something is wrong with me." But this fear does not come from reality itself. It comes from the collapse of a familiar framework, the structure of assumptions you have been living inside without knowing it. Here is a fact that deserves your careful attention. The ego depends entirely on predictability. It survives by knowing what things mean, who you are, and what is supposed to happen next. When reality no longer fits neatly into these categories, the ego panics. It calls this panic confusion, disorientation, or unreality. But confusion is not the enemy of clarity. Confusion is what happens when old answers stop working and new ones have not yet appeared. It is a transitional state, not a failure. Notice how quickly the mind tries to label the experience. It wants to diagnose it, explain it away, or turn it into a problem to be solved. This is because the ego cannot tolerate open-endedness. It must close the question as soon as possible. Yet reality itself is open-ended. It is alive, moving, unfinished. The attempt to freeze it into something solid is what creates the sense of artificiality in the first place. When that freezing fails, the illusion cracks, and the world feels strange. Another fact you can observe directly is this: the sense of unreality intensifies when you try to think your way out of it. Thought created the structure that is dissolving. It cannot repair it. Trying to restore certainty through thinking is like trying to calm turbulent water by stirring it. This is why grounding yourself purely in explanations often makes things worse. Explanations are still part of the map. What you are being invited into is the territory. The ego reacts strongly because it senses its own impermanence. It realizes, often unconsciously, that it is not a solid entity but a pattern of habits, memories, and expectations. When those patterns loosen, the ego interprets it as a threat to existence. But here is the crucial point. What is threatened is not your life, but a story about your life. Reality feeling unreal is often the moment you glimpse that life is happening without your narrative running the show. Breathing continues. Sounds arise, sensations appear. Existence does not pause while the mind struggles to interpret it. This realization can feel dizzying. If the story is not in control, then who is? And the honest answer is unsettling to the ego, but deeply liberating to awareness. Life is doing itself. This is why people describe these moments as both terrifying and peaceful. Terrifying to the identity that wants control, peaceful to the awareness that no longer has to maintain it. You may notice time behaving strangely during these moments. The past feels distant, the future feels abstract, only the immediate present has weight. This is not dysfunction. It is consciousness disengaging from psychological time and returning to direct experience. Psychological time, the constant movement between memory and anticipation, is what makes reality feel rigid and familiar. When it drops away, reality feels fluid, dreamlike, and unfamiliar. But unfamiliar does not mean false. In fact, this fluidity is closer to how reality actually is. Everything is changing continuously. The sense of solidity was created by repetition and habit, not by permanence. Here is an argument that may challenge you. Reality has always been this strange. You are only noticing it now because the mind's filters have weakened. The world has not changed. Your relationship to it has. Most people never encounter this consciously because they immediately reattach to certainty. They distract themselves, redefine themselves, or numb the experience. But if you stay with it gently, without panic, something remarkable happens. You begin to sense that what is real is not the interpretation, but the experiencing itself. Not the thought, "I am here," but the raw fact of being here. This is why trying to return to normal often feels unsatisfying after such experiences. Normal was built on assumptions that no longer feel honest. You can pretend, but you cannot unsee what you have seen. When you stop fighting the feeling that reality has become unreal, something subtle begins to change. The panic eases, not because answers arrive, but because the demand for answers relaxes. You realize that the problem was never the strangeness itself, but your insistence that things must feel familiar in order to be real. Here is a fact that becomes obvious only when you stop resisting it. Reality does not need your understanding to exist. It does not wait for your explanations. It unfolds on its own terms. The moment you allow that, the sense of unreality softens into curiosity. You begin to notice that what felt hollow was not the world, but the mental overlay you had been relying on. When that overlay thins, the world does not disappear. It becomes more immediate. Sounds feel closer. Sensations feel sharper. The present moment regains weight. This is where the great misunderstanding clears. You were never losing reality. You were losing your second-hand version of it. The ego feared this because it depends on distance. It survives by standing back, interpreting, comparing, judging. Direct experience threatens it, because direct experience does not require a narrator. Life simply happens. When you let experience be immediate, identity becomes lighter, not erased, but transparent. You still function, still speak, still act, but without the constant need to define yourself while doing so. This is why reality, once allowed to be fluid, begins to feel intimate again. Not solid in the old rigid sense, but alive. You stop asking whether things are real and start noticing that they are happening. Even uncertainty changes character here. It no longer feels like danger. It feels like openness, possibility, movement. The need to pin everything down loosens. Here is an argument worth carrying with you. Reality was never meant to feel like a fixed object. It is a process. When you try to grasp a process, it feels unreal. When you participate in it, it feels natural. You begin to trust experience without constantly interpreting it. Thought still appears, but it no longer dominates. It becomes a tool again, not the gatekeeper of existence. This is where a quiet confidence emerges. Not confidence in beliefs, but confidence in awareness itself. You know that whatever arises, confusion, clarity, fear, wonder, can be met directly. Nothing needs to be excluded. The sense of unreality that once frightened you now feels like a reminder that the world is larger than your ideas about it. A reminder that life is not a concept to be understood, but an event to be lived. So, when reality stops feeling real, do not rush to escape it. Pause, notice, listen. Let the strangeness show you what familiarity was hiding. Because what you are discovering is not the loss of reality, it is the loss of illusion. And what remains immediate, vivid, and undeniable is life itself, happening now.